Ever since the days of Sega's Genesis does what Nintendo don't campaign, people have been conditioned to expect that the more powerful a piece of hardware is, the better the games for it must be. An assumption which isn't necessarily wrong, as it allows developers more freedom to make what they want without having to worry if the system will explode from trying to run it. And when they do release on weaker hardware, typically you get something that ranges from not bad, just a very clear downgrade, to whatever the hell happened with the Switch ports of Sonic Colors Ultimate and Mortal Kombat 1. However, this isn't something that should be taken as an unequivocal truth, as on top of the countless remasters or remakes you're probably thinking of right now that are noticeably worse than their original releases, there have actually been a few times where the supposed watered-down ports made for older systems were actually significantly better than the main version for whatever the newest set of consoles at the time were. So get comfy as I showcase some of the games that were better on weaker hardware. When the name Yuji Naka comes up, there's likely two things people immediately think of: Sonic the Hedgehog and getting arrested for insider trading at Square Enix. But between those two events, the man was working at his own development studio called Prope, who mostly made smaller titles such as Ivy the Kiwi, Let's Tap, as well as some of the games from the Street Pass Me Plaza. One of the most turbulent releases to come from the studio was 2015's Rodea the Sky Soldier for the 3DS and Wii U, which took inspiration from Naka's work in the 90s like Nights into Dreams and Sonic, with it overall getting a mixed to negative reaction, mostly criticizing the poor visuals, low frame rate, and a really bad control scheme, which has you aim at objects with a control stick and then pressing a button to fly towards it. However, one interesting thing about the game's release is that first print copies of the Wii U version came bundled with a Wii port, and as you may expect from the title, this Wii version is noticeably better than the others, thanks to a mix of both a better control scheme by having you aim with the Wii Remote's IR sensor, and whilst not being the best a Wii game has looked, is still miles better than the other versions in terms of presentation. The best showcase in this gap in quality being the review from Nintendo Force magazine, which not only scored the Wii version an 8 out of 10 compared to the Wii U version's 4 out of 10, but even went as far as to suggest that people should throw away the Wii U disc completely and only play the Wii version. So why exactly is it so much better? And additionally, why was there a Wii version of a game released in 2015 that isn't Just Dance? Well, it turns out that Naka had always envisioned the game to only be played on the Wii, but the Japanese publisher, Kadokawa, also wanted a 3DS version, with them deciding to make that port on their own. The issue being that whilst Kadokawa is a multimedia conglomerate with full or partial ownerships of all kinds of different studios, they never really developed games in-house. The end result was that despite completing the Wii game in 2011, Kadokawa didn't finish their 3DS ports until 2013, and by then the Wii had been discontinued and the Wii U was already 2 years old, leading them to then decide to cancel the Wii release and greenlight a Wii U version. But instead of just getting Probe to convert their Wii port, which as a reminder was the original version, Naka's vision of what the game was supposed to be, and the Wii U was capable of using the exact same controllers, Kadokawa instead decided to port over their inferior 3DS version, which in turn caused the game to get delayed by another 2 years. So to summarize, the Wii U version of Rodea is an upscaled 3DS port of a Wii game which was made by a publisher with little experience in game development, hence why it looks and plays so much worse in comparison. Luckily, this would be the last time Naka would be involved in behind-the-scenes chicanery. Well, at least until he pretended Naoto Oshima didn't exist, tried to throw Square and Arzest under the bus for Balan Wonderworld's failure, and the previously mentioned getting arrested for insider trading, but other than that, his record's been completely clean since. Okay, admittedly this one is a bit of a stretch, but it's a bit too interesting to not include here. So, who watching this remembers Dark Void? You know, Dark Void? 2010 third-person shooter published by Capcom about a guy with a jetpack fighting aliens with help from Nikola Tesla? Yeah, I don't blame you for not remembering. It was one of the many games that came out during Capcom's various attempts to try and appeal to Western audiences, of which pretty much the only success was Dead Rising, with everything else being remembered in infamy, if it was even bad enough to be worth remembering. Dark Void was not one of these, the general reaction being that it had some interesting concepts, but the game overall was just really mid due to a mix of not doing enough to stand out from other shooters that swamped the 7th generation after the success of Modern Warfare and the first Gears of War, along with just generally being very buggy. Pretty much the only part of this game that has had any kind of staying power wasn't even from the game itself, and instead a smaller project that resulted from Dark Void's marketing campaign. Specifically, Dark Void Zero, a DSiWare title released just one day before Dark Void, which was advertised as being a port of a cancelled Capcom arcade game, effectively pretending that this was the game that Dark Void was a revival of, it being an 8-bit style platformer with a similar gameplay style to Metroid, the whole thing effectively being made on a whim after someone thought of it as a joke when they heard an 8-bit rendition of the Dark Void theme during the credits of a pre-release build. However, what's arguably funnier is the fact that what was essentially an out-of-season April Fool's Day joke was actually better received and more well-liked than the actual game it was made to promote, sitting with a score of 84 on Metacritic compared to Dark Void's 59. Sure, you can argue the difference could stem from retro throwbacks being a then-recent trend in gaming, and the expectations of a £4 DSiWare game being lower than a £50 PS3 360 game, but it's still not a great look when your big release is getting upstaged by an actual joke game. Regardless, it's at least good to know that you can always find some light even in the darkest voids of mediocrity. Daikatana is a game that realistically doesn't need an introduction owing to its legacy, with anything you could need to know about it being perfectly summarized with this singular ad for it. For anyone still at a loss, Daikatana was a game that was hyped into oblivion mainly owing to the fact it was the first title made by John Romero, one of the co-creators of games like Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake, following his exit from id Software to form Ion Storm. To make a long story short, after constant delays and behind-the-scenes drama caused it to miss its original 1997 release date by 3 years, when the game finally released, not only did it come nowhere close to meeting people's expectations, owing to the game's poor level design, awful AI, as well as graphics and gameplay that felt years behind its competition, it became widely regarded as being one of the worst games to release in 2000, on top of being just one of the worst FPS games of all time. The reaction being so overwhelmingly negative that it effectively killed John Romero's career and reputation for years. Now, if after hearing all that, you're expecting me to talk about the game's console port for the Nintendo 64, which was published by Kemco, you're wrong, as it's basically the exact same game but with worse performance, no voice acting, and the AI-controlled partner characters were removed from the gameplay. Instead, we're going even weaker with the handheld conversion, also handled by Kemco, with Daikatana's Game Boy Color port, which, due to a mix of Kemco staff wanting to make a different kind of game, it being a specific quest from Romero, and the general fact that the Game Boy Color realistically could not run an FPS that is remotely playable, this version of the game is actually a Zelda-like action RPG, specifically being inspired by a mix of both Zelda 1 and Link's Awakening, its story and level themes being the same as the main game, albeit with some slightly botched translations. Whilst definitely wearing its influences on its sleeves, I don't think it's too hard to picture that a solid Zelda clone for handhelds would generally be more well-liked than what I previously called one of the worst FPS games of all time. In fact, the press were able to pick up that this was the best version of the game before either of them released, owing to its presence at E3 with people from sites like IGN and GameSpot praising how good it looked and how it showed more promise than the PC version, leading to some disappointment when the American release was cancelled due to how poorly received the main version of the game was, as well as how generally toxic the Daikatana brand had become by that point. By the way, if you think I'm being remotely hyperbolic about how bad the main game is, and how the Game Boy Color version surely can't be that much better. Not only is the PC version on Steam, meaning you can play it right now to see just how awful it is, but I'll end this section by once again reminding you that this ad is in fact real and made it to print. Godspeed, John Romero. Godspeed. Let's end things off with a story that's a bit of a doozy. So in a previous video, I discussed how Indiana Jones has a fairly extensive history within video games, both in terms of adaptations of the movies and original stories told through the medium. However, what was arguably the most controversial of these releases was Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings, which was initially announced in 2005 with plans to release on both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It's seeing Indy attempting to both find his former mentor and to stop the Nazis from obtaining the staff Moses used to split the Red Sea. Despite a lot of excitement for the game at the time, especially with the fact its scheduled release year of 2007 put it in close proximity of the then upcoming and highly anticipated fourth movie, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, the project would face a lot of internal issues that got in the way of development. The three main events which led to its ultimate fate being a large amount of staff getting transferred over to work on Star Wars The Force Unleashed, constant layoffs and changes in leadership at the studio, and internal interest in the title being lost after Naughty Dog's Uncharted release, and did most of what LucasArts was trying to do with Staff of Kings. Ultimately, the game would end up being cancelled. Or at least LucasArts' version was cancelled. As well as the PS3 and 360 versions would never see the light of day, the studio had contracted other developers to make ports for weaker systems, the majority being done by Artificial Mind and Movement, or A2M, who were hired to make versions of the Staff of Kings for the Wii, PlayStation 2, and the DS, all of which released in June 2009. So, as a side effect of all this, the Wii port effectively became the main version of the title, which whilst looking very impressive in terms of graphics for a third-party Wii game, is unfortunately heavily held back by the same problem that affected a lot of games during the Wii era, that being incredibly unnecessary and imprecise motion controls, which instead of making the experience more immersive or simpler to understand, just increases the chances of misinputs and is overall less intuitive than just pressing buttons. Combine that with the story just missing a lot of explanations over who anyone is, their motives, and how specific sequences connect, likely due to it being an abridged version of a game that never released, and it overall makes for one of Indy's weaker adventures. The only real highlight being how, as an unlockable bonus, you can actually play one of the earlier Indiana Jones games, specifically 1992's Fate of Atlantis. Now, if you're expecting the improved version to be either the PS2 or DS ports, unfortunately you're not quite there. As well as the PS2 version doesn't have any of the motion controls, making it overall easier to play, it otherwise still has all of the exact same issues the Wii version had, making it a marginal improvement at best. Meanwhile, the DS version reviewed even worse, with the forced and unnecessary motion controls being swapped out for forced and unnecessary touchscreen controls. For the actual best version, we need to look at the only one A2M weren't involved with, that being the PSP version made by Amaze Entertainment, which in addition to not having the gimmicky controls the Wii and DS versions had, owing to this version just generally doing a better job at relaying the original story through a mix of cutscenes and text recaps before each mission, it's commonly viewed amongst indie fans as being the version that came the closest to capturing the original vision of the cancelled PS3 and 360 versions, which when combined with the fact that the only real sacrifices made for this port were almost exclusively visual downgrades, you end up in a scenario where the best of the four versions was the one on the least popular system. I think we'll end things here for now, but I hope this has shown that power isn't everything. That just because you have the best graphics or most scope, that doesn't automatically mean you have the better game. Especially when the people making the higher end games have no idea what the hell they're doing.